Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's been another day of political drama. Boris Johnson has been in Luxembourg for his first talks as PM with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. The Prime Minister told the BBC he was optimistic a deal could be done and that the EU had had a bellyful of Brexit. The latter was borne out by an extraordinary news conference this afternoon. Noisy protesters meant Mr Johnson decided not to attend. The Luxembourg Prime Minister went ahead anyway and laid into the UK for causing the Brexit crisis and said the campaign to leave the EU, led by Mr Johnson, had just been lies. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, was there.
On the way, but to what?
Good morning.
Air miles can't be exchanged for a deal with the European Union, as Boris Johnson heads off to see one of Europe's deal makers.
I want to stress, Laura, that you shouldn't be getting your hopes up today. Today is not going to be a breakthrough day.
So prepare too for a risky departure. Not getting a deal is far from 1,000,000 to 1 these days.
I mean, it's September already, and you moved into number 10 in July, and it's only now you're going to see Jean-Claude Juncker. You could have done this weeks and weeks ago.
We have had many conversations with our friends and partners, and they've moved a long way since the beginning of August.
Having been accused of hardly trying, the Prime Minister is visibly now making an effort for a deal. But racing through Luxembourg's streets does not mean we're speeding towards an agreement.
We think that we can satisfy the European Commission and our friends on the key points. Can we protect the single market, the integrity of the single market? Can we ensure there's no checks at the border in Northern Ireland? I think a deal is there to be done, and of the kind that I've described. But clearly, if we can't get movement from them on that crucial issue of whether the EU can continue to control the UK, we won't be able to get that through the House of Commons. No way.
What you're saying there is just articulating the problem that's been articulated forever. Can you foresee a solution, for example, when in some areas Northern Ireland would follow EU rules and the rest of the UK would not?
What we want to see is a solution where the decision is taken by the UK.
But what is the actual solution that you're proposing? I mean, is it giving more power to Stormont, for example?
These are certainly some of the ideas that are being talked about. This is all doable. It's all doable with energy and goodwill. There's a germ of an idea there.
But it's just the germ of an idea.
And so, well, there's a lot of thinking going on.
However many hands you can shake in the 45 days before we're due to leave, the two sides have tangled for months over practical conundrums.
Well, we're cautious.
Cautious in your business.
And the two sides at home are in a new contradiction.
We've been working very hard. We've had a good, productive exchange. Has there been a total breakthrough? I wouldn't say so. Am I more optimistic than I was when we took off this morning? I would say a little bit, but not much.
MPs have changed the law to try to stop you taking the UK out without a deal at the end of October. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you propose to get round that? Because you keep saying you've got no intention of delaying.
I won't. Look, here's what I won't. I will uphold the Constitution. I will obey the law, but we will come out on October the 31st.
Well, how, if the MPs have changed the law to stop you doing that?
We're going to come out on October the 31st,
but
and it's vital that people understand that the UK will not extend. We won't go on remaining in the EU beyond October 30th. What on earth is the point?
But that means that you are looking for a way round the law.
Well, you know, those are your words. What we're going to do is come out on October the 31st, deal or no deal, and staying in beyond October the 31st is completely crackers.
But do you really think that you want to be the kind of Prime Minister that is looking of ways of sneaking around the law to keep to your political promise? I mean, everybody knows how strongly you feel.
These are all your words.
But how will you do it then?
Well,
will you challenge it in court? Will you take Parliament to court to stop yourself?
Our first priority, if I may say so, just to try and look on the bright side for a second or two, is to come out with a deal. And actually, that is what our friends and partners in the EU would like too. And I think that they've had a bellyful of all this stuff.
They have, if this was anything to go by. Number 10 wanted to take questions from reporters inside because of a small group of pro-EU protesters making a big noise. But the Luxembourg leader went outside anyway, angry about this situation, but savouring this moment.
So now it's on Mr. Johnson. He holds the future of all UK citizens and every EU citizen living in the UK in his hands. It's his responsibility.
It does seem, since you've been in office, that some of the things that you have done, you seem to believe the conventions and rules somehow don't apply to you.
Really? Well, I humbly, respectfully disagree. If you're talking about having a Queen's speech, I think that was the right thing to do. We need a Queen's speech. And by the way, all this mumbo jumbo about how Parliament is being deprived of the opportunity to scrutinise Brexit. What a load of claptrap. Actually, Parliament, I think, has lost about 4 or 5 days. And I think actually what the people of our country want is a little less of this sort of gloom.
One of the people who's extremely gloomy about what's happened is your old friend and rival and colleague David Cameron. Now, he says that the Leave campaign that you led lied. He said that you behaved appallingly. I
have the highest respect and affection and regard for him. He and I worked together for many years, and I think he has a legacy turning the economy around that I think he can be very, very proud of. So that's my view on Dave and what he's got to say.
He's been pretty brutal about you.
Well, really. I mean, you know.
Another Tory Prime Minister whose fate will be decided by our relationship with the EU. With time so short, the volume is going up as the clock ticks down. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Luxembourg.
Let's speak to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's in Brussels. Katya, the EU meetings that we see on the news week after week are usually diplomatic and polite. The Luxembourg Prime Minister was anything but. Why the change in tone?
Well, I think what you've got there is a change of tone in public, Fiona, but really not in private. I mean, from Luxembourg's Prime Minister today, that was a spilling over into the public domain of the kind of levels of frustration that I regularly hear when I'm talking in off-the-record conversations with European politicians and diplomats. Number one, frustration, Fiona, that more than 3 years after our referendum on EU membership, we, the UK as a country, our MPs are still divided about what kind of Brexit we want, or whether we want Brexit at all, which makes the EU feel that they could perform somersaults in negotiations, make all sorts of compromises, and still not be sure that the resulting Brexit deal would actually pass through Parliament. Frustration number two that we heard there from Luxembourg's Prime Minister today, EU leaders hate always being depicted as the villains when it comes to Brexit by so many high-profile UK politicians and journalists as well, because they say as this process goes on and on, they are facing problems as well. This uncertainty is very costly for European businesses as well, and EU governments are having to spend millions, Fiona, on preparing for a possible no-deal Brexit. So what does all this mean? Does it mean that the EU has just had it, that it's not going to engage anymore at all with the Johnson government? Well, no, actually it doesn't mean that, and that's why it's so rare to hear ranty outbursts like this from EU leaders, because they've decided as long as there is a hope of a Brexit deal, it is worth their while to engage. So they say they are waiting and watching and hoping for concrete proposals now to come from the UK government that they insist they have not yet received.
Katya, thank you.
It proved to be the day that Bojo went no-show. Boris Johnson in Luxembourg for talks with EU officials abruptly pulled out of a joint press conference with the country's Prime Minister Xavier Bettel. Amid noisy anti-Brexit protests opposite the podiums, Mr Bettel, who heads one of Europe's smallest countries, promptly upstaged Mr Johnson by going ahead without him, describing Brexit as a nightmare for EU citizens. You can't hold people hostage for party political reasons, he said, and don't blame us for the mess you made. Mr Johnson is still insisting there is time to agree a Brexit deal. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, has this report.
Amid the fairy tale spires and fantasy turrets of Middle Europe, Boris Johnson received what the European Commission regards as a cold dose of reality. Over the weekend, the Prime Minister had likened himself to the Incredible Hulk, throwing off the manacles of EU membership, and he said there were real signs of movement on the Northern Irish backstop. But here, for his first meeting with the outgoing Commission President, Mr Johnson toned his optimism down even before it collided with a polite but firm message from Jean-Claude Juncker.
Boris, sorry, we have to pay attention again. Come on. Over here? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Why are you so optimistic, Mr. Johnson?
Well, we're cautious.
Cautiously optimistic.
Over lunch, the Prime Minister was yet again told it was up to the UK to come up with a legally workable solution to the Irish border issue that was compatible with the current withdrawal agreement. And the Commission said in a statement later, such a proposal had still not been made. Afterwards, Mr Johnson was booed by protesters, many of them British.
Prime Minister, was there any progress today?
Still, his officials called the meeting constructive, and Mr Juncker had been left in no doubt that the UK was leaving on October the 31st. The British say the contours of a deal are clear. The Europeans complain that there is still no content. With just a month till the critical European Council summit, the only real agreement here was that negotiations should soon become a daily event.
In English, sir, was there any progress today?
The negotiations will continue at a higher level and with a higher speed.
Have you seen concrete proposals, written down proposals from the British?
The Commission President didn't answer that. But the British say there is a serious plan, which Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator, should engage with now, even though it may not be published before the UN General Assembly begins next week. At the offices of Luxembourg's Prime Minister, the jeering from some 75 demonstrators outside intensified. And when the two Prime Ministers emerged, Boris Johnson bypassed the planned press conference in this courtyard, complaining that the noise would have drowned him out, which it almost certainly would have done, leaving Xavier Bettel gesticulating at an empty podium with the Union Jack still in place.
I wanted to thank Mr. Johnson, who was here today, for the exchange that we had. We need more than just words. We need a legally operable text to work on as soon as possible if we want to meet the October deadline. You can't hold a future hostage for party political gains. So now it's on Mr. Johnson. He holds the future of all UK citizens, and every EU citizen leaving the UK in his hands.
It was a public and unprecedented humiliation of his absent guest. Though afterwards Mr Johnson repeated that there was a good chance of a Brexit deal if only the Northern Irish backstop was scrapped.
But if we can get that done, as I've said before, then we're at the races. And I think we've got actually just the right amount of time to do a deal between now and the 17th, 18th of October. But as I never tire of telling you, if we can't do a deal by then, and obviously we want to work very hard to do it, if we can't do it by then we'll make sure that we can come out on the 31st of October, deal or no deal.
Just the right amount of time to do a deal, he says. But there was no apparent bridge to one forged here today. That prize still beyond grasp. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Luxembourg.
The Prime Minister is back in Downing Street now. Our political correspondent Paul McNamara is there. Paul, the latest.
Yes, well, the Prime Minister arrived back a little while ago through the back doors, and by that moment, the blame game was already well underway. A number 10 source telling us that they asked repeatedly to move the press conference inside. There was a press centre there where the Brexit Secretary, Stephen Barclay, did a press conference from on his last trip to Luxembourg, but the government of Luxembourg just weren't playing ball. The government of Luxembourg put out a statement today saying, we would have preferred a joint press conference and there was no reason not to do one. The request to move one inside came too late and there was not enough space inside, so the only option for logistical purpose was to hold it outside. Look, I think what you got a real sense of today is that the Prime Minister of Luxembourg was relishing this moment. We were told at the start of the day that this would be mainly statements. There'd be no time for any questions. He not only made a statement, he took lots of questions and really relished the moment. And ultimately, Boris Johnson is ending today with this being the talking point and not his plans for Brexit. And that is not going to be what he hoped for come the end of today.
Paul McNamara in Downing Street.
So after everything that Mr Cameron has said about Brexit and Mr Johnson's tactics, what of Mr Johnson's talks with European leaders today? Well, as a visual illustration of how they went, this image is not a particularly encouraging one. On the right, Luxembourg's Prime Minister Xavier Bettel. On the left, as you can see, an empty lectern where our Prime Minister should have been standing. Mr Johnson dodged their post-meeting outdoor news conference. He was worried anti-Brexit protesters would have drowned them out, but it gave Mr Bettel a chance to say what he really thought about Brexit, and it wasn't pretty.
When he walked into the courtyard of the Prime Minister's office in Luxembourg, Boris Johnson would have realised this was going to be a noisy affair. Not the people of Luxembourg turning against him, but 50 or so angry Britons, armed with placards and a sound system over which they'd been playing the European anthem. Too much, said number 10 once the two leaders began talking. Let's move it inside. Nothing big enough inside, said his hosts, for the 100-plus journalists crowded into the courtyard. Then I'm not doing it, said Mr Johnson, and left to a fresh chorus of heckles and boos. His hosts, however, had promised a press conference, and press conference there was going to be. The man who styled himself the Incredible Hulk, now transformed into the Invisible Man.
I wanted to thank Mr. Johnson, who was here today.
Freed from the restraints of good manners to a guest, Prime Minister Bettel angrily insisted Europe won't be blamed if things end badly.
It's on Mr. Johnson. They decide, I deeply regret it, but don't put the blame on us, because now they don't know how to get out of this situation. They put themselves in.
In a single interview afterwards, Mr Johnson insisted it was his host he'd been concerned about.
I don't think it would have been fair to the Prime Minister of Luxembourg to, I think there was clearly going to be a lot of noise, and I think our points might have been drowned out, but I'm happy to talk to you now.
Lost amongst all this was Boris Johnson's important first meeting with the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier. To talk of progress would be to overstate things.
Well, we're cautious.
Cautiously optimistic.
Yes, they've agreed the pace of talks will accelerate, but on the backstop, one still insists it's essential, the other that it's unacceptable. But it will be this picture of a British Prime Minister beating a hasty retreat from a noisy protest that's ended up being the image of another contentious day in the Brexit saga.
James joins us now. A lot of theatre today, James. What does it actually amount to? Has there been any sign of progress at all today?
Well, it was all quite illustrative. I mean, the theatre was unfortunate. I certainly don't think it was deliberate. I think it was poor planning around this on both sides. But what it led to was this extraordinary scene of, without Mr Johnson beside him, Prime Minister Bettel actually speaking his mind. And the reason it's so illustrative is because he basically said what many European leaders are thinking at the moment. They are really fed up that the way everything has been held hostage almost by this British psychodrama. They really want it over. They really don't want to be blamed for it, and that's why so many are biting their tongues, why they're going ahead with these talks now. They don't want some narrative to grow up that somehow the UK was pushed out. But they are very concerned about whether Boris Johnson really does want this deal. Think back to when Mr Johnson and Angela Merkel stood next to each other at that press conference, and she said, we can sort this out in 30 days. And he said, yes, of course we can, 30 days, plenty of time. That was 26 days ago, and still they don't have any written British proposal as to how we ought to go on the table in front of them. So they worry about that. They worry about what he's doing at home in terms of proroguing Parliament. Of course, a big Supreme Court decision are going to be taken tomorrow, or at least a hearing going to be taken tomorrow about whether that was legal or not. They will be watching that here with great interest, as they have every twist and turn of this whole almost 3-year-long saga. But they won't be watching it with very much optimism and with growing irritation, it has to be said.
OK, James, thank you.
There were 2 podiums, just 1 speaker. The Prime Minister of Luxembourg, much to the astonishment of waiting crowds and audiences watching the live television feed, went ahead with his press conference, minus his guest, Boris Johnson. Britain's PM had asked to move the meeting indoors to escape the shouts of what he called a small but noisy group of protesters. But Xavier Bettel decided to style it out alone. What happened next was, depending on your Brexit perspective, either an arrogant attempt to humiliate a member state that no longer wants to be in the club, or an extraordinary nervous climb down for the man who just yesterday described himself as the Incredible Hulk. Tonight, Boris Johnson declared himself cautiously optimistic about a deal with Europe, reiterating that he would leave by October the 31st and wouldn't break the law or the Constitution. How? Here's Nick Ward.
A familiar, if unfriendly, welcoming party in the background. In the foreground, an empty podium, signalling perhaps, amid all the noise, a political dialogue of the deaf.
You can't hold a future hostage for party political gains.
Friendly applause for him, and then a bite.
So now it's on Mr. Johnson. He holds the future of all UK citizens.
An isolated Prime Minister had found his European friends unwilling to help out. No to a move inside to avoid the anti-Brexit chance. Boris Johnson put his non-appearance down to English manners.
Well, I don't think it would have been fair to the Prime Minister of Luxembourg to... I think there was clearly going to be a lot of noise, and I think our points might have been drowned out.
Back home, Brexiteers were unamused.
Well, we're used to this sort of black ops behaviour. It started way back, remember, with the papers on the table. There's briefing and counter-briefing. Boris Johnson is aware of this. This is a very delicate situation, a very crucial juncture. There will be these psychological games, but he won't be knocked off. He's very much focused on getting a deal by October the 31st, and I think the chances are 50-50 that he will be able to expedite that deal, and he'll be able to sell the deal back into Parliament, and we will leave on the 31st of October.
Number 10 says it's deadly serious about a deal which will focus on the vexed issue of the Northern Ireland border. It's calling for give and take on both sides. Boris Johnson says he's willing to give ground by agreeing that Northern Ireland would closely align with the EU in areas where there's already major cross-border cooperation on agri-food and electricity. But Number 10 wants the EU to respect the referendum and the integrity of the UK by accepting that Northern Ireland cannot be in the single market and customs union.
Well, obviously the EU are looking to the UK government and trying to identify what space for compromise there is. Now, given the time available, there aren't many options that could work. Now, one of the things we're hearing is that government is contemplating Northern Ireland specific provisions, so aligning Northern Ireland with the rest of the EU to facilitate that trade across the border, and then make certain exemptions for other things. Now, whether that flies or not really depends on how negotiations go with the EU. They've been very consistent that there cannot be any cherry picking of the single market.
The Liberal Democrats believe Boris Johnson has no interest in a deal.
I don't think the Prime Minister has seriously been trying to negotiate a deal for many weeks now. He should have started this immediately he became Prime Minister. No, I think his aim was always to leave without a deal, and now he hasn't been able to achieve that because we've passed a law stopping him leaving without a deal. He's scrambling around trying to square a circle, which frankly is impossible to do. I think what we are faced with now is a clear choice. If you want to avoid no deal, you either vote for a deal or you vote to stop Brexit.
Friends and the occasional foe say that Boris Johnson's hardball tactics are genuinely designed to secure and not scupper a deal. But one Brexit veteran from within the heart of government tells me some EU leaders are saying nice things now, but are they really going to sign up to a deal that seeks to avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland outside the formal structures of the EU?
I want my freedom back! Boris, come here!
In full voice as Boris Johnson visits EU partners. Soon protesters will plant their flags in more familiar surroundings as the Brexit battle returns to these shores.
That was Nick Watt, and joining us now, Tobias Ellwood, the former Conservative Defence Minister. Were you embarrassed, Tobias, by that no-show from the Prime Minister today, or do you think he was right to duck out?
I think he was right to duck out. You saw the atmosphere outside the meeting there. It's a bit like trying to conduct a press conference outside the Red Lion in Parliament Square. It's not the appropriate place to do it, and I'm sorry the choreography wasn't better handled. It would have been nice to have had that press conference, but also Xavier Bettel, I think, illustrated the frustration that we're all feeling. It's been 3 years since the referendum, and we're still trying to secure a deal. What we did see today, though, more importantly, was the fact that he sat down with Jean-Claude Juncker for 2 hours, and they had, I think, meaningful discussions. We're now going to see the official meetings move to every single day, and that is progress. So yes, of course, it didn't look good in Luxembourg, but far better results with the President of the Commission.
I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? 45 days to go and they're only just meeting every day. Yes, you characterise that frustration on the part of the EU. They are our negotiating partner. They're not a watching public. If this is the indication of the strength of anger now that a Prime Minister who's known to be cordial and mild-mannered in political circles can't even manage to move a press conference indoors, what are we holding out for?
Well, we're holding out for a deal, and it's important that we focus on that and stay measured. I know we constantly want to see results. We want to see that answer. We want to see the details of a deal, but there's nothing easy about this at all. You just touched on, Nick Watts just touched on some of the details that still needs to be covered to do with the Northern Ireland backstop. How do you reconcile customs differences and regulatory compliance?
We all know the problems
but we're now seeing, after a lot of scoping taking place.
But I'm just pointing out to you that the signs tonight do not look encouraging. When the Prime Minister said he was slightly more optimistic this evening than he was this morning, you have to wonder what would have gone wrong for him to feel any worse.
No, I encourage everybody to focus on the timetable here. It's the 14th of October that counts, the EU summit. What we've seen is a Prime Minister have those meetings in Paris, in Berlin, with Macron, with Merkel. He's met people at the G7 as well. He's now met the Luxembourg Prime Minister. He was with Leo Varadkar last week. And we're now talking about the details. It has taken, yes, a little bit of time, probably more time than the
3 years, and he's got less than a month. Do you think he's going to pull it out the bag now?
Measured. Let's allow this process to continue until the 14th of October. That's when the details of the deal must be presented, not today or tomorrow.
My question to you, though, is when you see that kind of frustration with one of the EU's leaders, do you really think that they're in a positive negotiating frame of mind?
Well, I'm hoping that they will stay professional and stay positive. As I say, it is some very micro details about how small, medium and large businesses operate on both sides of the border. And that is what we're boiling down to now. But absolutely right. All of us are deeply frustrated. The nation is frustrated, not least with our own parliamentarians. We saw today a very bizarre position taken by the Liberal Democrats, going out on an extreme position. They're never going to be able to achieve that. They want to be that party that governs for Britain, and yet they're actually saying go back to your constituencies and vote Remain.
Well,
how is that going to go down
in many
of their seats, which are leave facing?
You
simply won't recognise it. Unfortunately,
you can't back a PM who says do or die and call other people extreme. Sorry.
Well, OK, that's your view. I'm saying that this Prime Minister is trying to focus on a deal, and I don't take away from the fact that we're under huge pressure. But we've also seen a party that actually called for a referendum move its position, and it's actually the art of compromise. It's because 650 MPs cannot agree in the House of Commons. That's why we're here today. That's why we're still trying to resolve Brexit.
Thanks, Tobias. Just stay with us because we're going to be talking to Lord Jonathan Sumption in a second. Much of what happens, of course, depends on how those in power choose to interpret the law. A reminder of what Boris Johnson said when asked if he was prepared to break the law after he once again ruled out asking for an extension to the Brexit date. Have a listen.
I mean, to be really clear about this, Parliament has changed the law to make it almost impossible to take us out of the EU without a deal at the end of October. But you say that you will not do it. Now, that means that you must be looking for a way around the law.
Well, you know, those are your words. What we're going to do is come out on October the 31st, deal or no deal, and staying in beyond October the 31st is completely crackers.
Well, that was Boris Johnson speaking to Laura Kunsberg, our political editor. Tomorrow we're expecting the Supreme Court to return with their ruling on whether the PM did break the law by his suspension of Parliament. Last week, you might remember, 4 Scottish judges said that he'd acted unlawfully. Lord Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court Justice, is with me. How did you interpret what the Prime Minister said today, that we would be leaving anyway on October the 31st, even if there were no deal?
Well, he didn't say in terms he was going to break the law, and I imagine that his advisers told him he'd be rather foolish to say that. But I don't see how he can leave without a deal as the Act is presently structured. It's a very tightly drafted Act. It's obviously been professionally drafted, and the courts interpret legislation so as to give effect to its obvious purpose, unless there's something in the language that makes that absolutely impossible.
He distinctly said, I'll obey the law, but we'll come out on October the 31st. It's vital. We won't carry on belonging to the EU. So you don't think there is any mechanism for him to do that?
Well, I can't see one. He seems to me simply to be saying, I'm going to have a square circle.
Do you think he's lying?
No, that's not a lie. It's just an absurdity.
Is it watertight? Is there any loophole? I mean, Dominic Raab suggests this morning that the law, he said, we're looking at the law very carefully, as if he was suggesting that the law itself that was made was flawed.
I'd be more impressed by that if Mr. Raab told us what he thought the famous loophole was. We've heard loopholes from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we've heard about it from the Foreign Secretary, but we haven't heard what the loopholes that they say exist are.
So, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to predict what you think will happen, but from the sound of it, if we're not leaving on the 31st, and if there isn't a deal, we will be breaking the law if we come out of the EU.
Well, I don't think it's going to get to that, because before we reach the 31st, there are enforcement procedures which can ensure that an application is made for an extension.
Do judges look for loopholes?
No. They don't. They look for ways of closing loopholes. They look for ways of saying that the purpose of the Act is actually achieved.
Let's just look at tomorrow, because we're expecting the Supreme Court to come back with anything concrete, or could it be further delayed?
I doubt whether they're going to come back with an answer tomorrow. More than a day's argument is expected, and they will take a little while to decide what they think. They'll probably then tell us what the answer is, and reserve their reasons until a later stage. But I can't see that happening much before the end of the week, or possibly the very beginning of next week.
Would it be odd for you if Scotland and the Supreme Court weren't on the same page?
The law is exactly the same in both Scotland and England. There may be a difference of opinion between the Scottish courts and the English courts as to what it is, but we've had the same Parliament and the same monarch for 300 years, and there can't be a different law in Scotland and in England about what the relations between them are.
So how do you explain the divergences of outcomes?
Well, one of the two courts is wrong.
And would you say which you think it is?
Well, I'm not going to be dogmatic about this because the situation is too novel. My own view is that the orthodox opinion is the one given by the English courts. But one has to accept that if you behave outrageously and defy the political culture on which our constitution depends, a lot of judges are going to be tempted to push the limits out. And the problem is that Boris Johnson has taken a hammer and sickle to our political culture. in a way that is profoundly provocative to people who believe that there ought to be solutions consistent with our traditions.
So I wonder whether you would accept that Kwasi Kwarteng or Peter Lilly on this programme on Friday night, when they suggest that the judiciary is in danger of being seen as political, they're making that point.
I think there is a danger of that. The essential issue is whether there are any legal standards by which you can distinguish between good political reasons for proroguing Parliament and bad political reasons for proroguing Parliament. If it's all politics, it's hard to see how the courts can decide between the two without taking an essentially political view. But we are in an extraordinarily unusual situation, and undoubtedly the government has behaved disgracefully. And that is a situation in which it's going to be very difficult to predict what happens.
So you would accept then that judiciary does have to become, to a degree, politicised?
No, I wouldn't. I think if they're wise, they will take the same view as the Divisional Court did in the High Court in England. But if the government loses, in a sense, it will serve them right. But serve you right is not really a very good juridical principle.
Presumably, though, the question is when does it become an issue? You would imagine the judiciary stepping in a hypothetical situation where the PM suspended Parliament, until the next election, until 2020.
Well, he couldn't do that for a variety of technical reasons, like the need to renew the taxes, the Army Act, and all the rest. So there's actually there are limits beyond which everybody agrees that you couldn't prorogue Parliament. The question is whether there are even tighter limits, as is being argued by Gina Miller's counsel.
Lord Sumption, thanks very much. Let's go briefly back to Tobias Ellwood. You heard there a former Supreme Court Justice say he didn't understand, understatement, how Boris Johnson could be considering not getting a deal and not breaking the law and bringing us out on October the 31st. Have you spoken to anyone, Tobias, that can help us understand how that could work?
Well, he said that this evening, and I think that probably needs further clarification. He did make it very clear that he wants a deal. I yield to the expertise of Judge Sumption, and I'm absolutely in favour of us remaining absolutely following the law. We are lawmakers, not lawbreakers. I'm a legislator. We create the law, but it's for judges to interpret it. And I think it'd be very clear, and I think it'd be a sad day if we went down this route that is being suggested. I mean, this whole period has been very abnormal. And I worry that breaking precedents and so forth, some of these things are becoming normal. We'll end up calling for a written constitution if this were to continue down this avenue. I do hope that we will conclude with a deal soon and we can move forward, but no doubt we'll have to come back and revisit some of the questions over the constitutional arrangements, not least with decisions in Scotland and England being different, but that will hopefully be resolved tomorrow, and probably we'll hear the result by Thursday or Friday.
Thank you both. Thank you very much.